Maryscott Greenwood. She is the CEO of the Canadian American Business Council. Thank you so much for taking time for us today. So, as I was saying, a lot actually that came out of this morning meeting. Scotty, can you start by just telling us what struck you as the most significant?
Well, the most significant, I think, is a feeling finally in Canada, the United States, and Mexico that we need to operate as a unit, that the North American neighborhood is meaningful, and we're going to join arms and confront some of the world's problems together, especially economically. And I know that sounds, kind of non-specific, but it's really important when you think about, are we going to compete against each other? Are we going to work together? And so that's the biggest sort of overarching theme that I see coming out of this summit.
Give me an example of where you see that.
Perfect example is the new trade agreement that we have, our favorite topic, the USMCA, as we call it here. There's a dispute resolution process in that, right? Mm-hmm. And there's currently a dispute in the automotive sector. And Canada and Mexico have gotten together and said to the US, we disagree with the way you are calculating North American content. It's awfully specific, but so that has gone to a dispute resolution process. We think it's going to come out in the next few weeks, and it's going to rule against the US in favor of Canada and Mexico. And so coming out of this summit, the U.S. has a choice to make. Does it abide by the ruling of the panel, if that's how it rules, against the U.S. and say, okay, well, we'll change how we do it and we'll comply with USMCA? Or does the U.S. do what it has done sometimes with WTO rulings, World Trade Organization rules, and say, we don't care? If it says we don't care and it ignores the panel, then this whole North American idea and all of this great rhetoric that's coming out of this summit today will be for naught. So I think the timing is almost perfect because it kind of forces the U.S. to live up to the rules-based trading system that it's touting right now. So I think it's good.
Okay, there are a couple of other issues that I really want to talk to you about. And speaking of almost perfect timing, I can't resist because a minute ago we saw Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino on screen. And I know you are quite excited about what we're hearing about the Nexus program and sorting things out there. So can you talk us through that?
Well, I mean, the Nexus is a very important trusted traveler program, as I'm sure your viewers know, between Canada and the United States. Our countries have been at an impasse about how to reopen the Nexus enrollment centers in Canada once the border reopened after COVID. The U.S. centers opened, the Canadian centers didn't, and there's been a disagreement this whole time about that. And as a result, mostly Canadians haven't been able to get their Nexus cards renewed, and they've had all kinds of disruptions at the airport, and this made even worse. So today we see a breakthrough and in the government's agreeing to reopen those centers, and they're doing it differently. There's kind of a new model. It's a model that we actually floated several months ago as a possibility, and it looks like we still need to get more details, but it looks like they're going to adopt something that we've been advocating for quite some time. So yes, we're happy. We think it's important.
Right on. And I want to ask you too, I mean, the Biden visit, right? It is something that sort of dominates the question about the Canada-U.S. relationship. He has said he's coming in March. So I guess we can already start parsing the significance of what that visit is going to look like. What will you be watching for? Because we know it's much anticipated. So what do you want to see about decisions he makes about what he does while he's here in Canada?
Well, it is a big deal. Anytime you can have the attention of a world leader focused just on you, that's a good thing. So we know that economic competitiveness and collaboration is important. We know carbon transition is important. I think critical minerals will be top of mind for the President of the United States when he goes to Canada. And Canada has an important story to tell there. So I think that's what it's about. The other issues are not bilateral. They are what's happening in the world and how can we work together to deal with those issues. So, there's no doubt the President of the United States will bring his wish list when he comes to Canada, just as all leaders do when they travel.
Okay, I want to bring another guest into our conversation, Scotty. Arturo Sarukhán. He's the former Mexican ambassador to the United States.
He's the best.
And he's joining you on the program right now. Welcome very much. To start with, I just wonder what you are looking to hear out of this joint news conference from the three leaders.
Well, I think that most North American Leaders Summit have tended to underwhelm and underdeliver. My concern a bit is that this one might do the same at a moment where geopolitical stakes are very high. They're very high for the United States in what is probably the most important recalibration of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, which is the United States' relationship with China, and how Mexico and Canada need to play a key role. They're sort of like a keystone, particularly when it comes to trade and economic issues, whether it's supply chains, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's how do we use a common paradigm for North American energy efficiency, energy security, energy independence. And so what I would hope comes out of this meeting that ends today in Mexico City is a clear roadmap, a clearer vision of how these three countries are profoundly interconnected, and hopefully that the diplomatic bandwidth coming from Washington in its engagement with Canada and its engagement with Mexico can be up to par to the needs that the three of us will be facing in the coming decades.
I'm curious to what extent you think you have seen that reflected thus far. And I will just pause for a moment here. This is perhaps a bit of a facile example, but here in Canada, this meeting is front page news. It's leading a lot of our newscasts. You look at the coverage in the United States on any major website today, and I can't find a mention of it on the main page. Does that say something about the extent to which at least the United States, but perhaps all the parties are engaged in the way that you're looking for?
Absolutely. I think the coverage in Canada is very similar to the coverage in Mexico. It's all over the news in Mexico. Here in Washington, much less. I think it's only those who follow these issues very closely that are sort of tweeting and writing and putting blogs. But there is a sense in Washington, I think, for those of us who've invested a lot of years in the North American relationship and the potential of the North American relationship, that the United States does tend to take both Canada and Mexico for granted. My hopes are that because of what's at stake in how the United States needs to rethink its economic and trade paradigm, whether it's nearshoring or reshoring, supply chains, essential minerals, how we ensure that the North American automotive juggernaut transitions successfully from what it is today to electronic vehicles, how both Canada and Mexico can piggyback on the chips, on the infrastructure, even sort of on a fuzzier, peachier issue. And I was listening in on the whole issue of trusted traveler. Mexico, Canada, and the United States will be co-hosts to the 2026 World Cup. Mexico has a global entry program with the US. Canada has its program with the United States, but the three systems don't talk to one another. We should, and this isn't, in my view, this is really small potatoes. It would be very important for the three countries to harmonize these three systems of trusted traveler programs, so that Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans, when they're traveling to the different games in the World Cup in Canada, Mexico, and the United States, can use this system. And so, I would hope that there's, besides some of these concrete issues that I think are important, the energy dispute, the ongoing energy dispute between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, which will play a very important role because, yes, we're all talking about nearshoring, but if you don't have an aligned energy paradigm, that nearshoring is not going to happen.
Well, our finance minister prefers friendshoring too, so there's another.
I like ally shoring, but
there we go. Scotty, I want to bring you in on this conversation because I'm reflecting a bit as we're talking about it, and what Arturo Sarukhán is saying. I think anybody listening at home would go, of course, we should all work together. Of course, there should be more harmony. Gosh, that's in the best interest of the world. When these leaders, or three leaders in these positions, get into the room, how much more difficult do you think that is when the rubber meets the road to actually try to get the three countries on the same page?
Well, when the three leaders are in the room together, Catherine, I think that's when it's the easiest because it's an individual, person-to-person, friend-to-friend, colleague-to-colleague conversation, and each one is clear-headed about what he wants out of it, and it's different what each wants out of it. I think where it gets difficult is domestic politics in all three countries, which are quite different for each of the leaders. And our systems are different. Our constitutional democracies and parliamentary systems are really different. And so that's the hard part. And that's why, we see that all three countries sent business delegations. All three countries will go back to their home capitals and talk a lot about the North American idea, which is something the ambassador and I were together in Mexico City several months ago talking about at a conference called the North Capital Forum. So you got to go back home and talk to civil society and business and labor and everybody else. That's where the hard work is. It's not at the leader meetings. Once the leaders get in the room together, they do pretty well.
Arturo, I wonder if you could just give us sort of like a bit of a snapshot when Scotty talks about the domestic politics. I mean, I think we've gotten a bit of a sense of it over the course of this meeting about what Andrés Manuel López Obrador is dealing with at home when it comes to some of the protectionist policies around the energy sector. But what should the big takeaway be for Canadians about what is front and center in his domestic agenda as he tries to engage with Canada and the U.S.?
Well, and I can't avoid. Scotty was talking about the personal dynamics once the three leaders are in the room. Believe me, as an ambassador who's been in several of these summits with obviously not these leaders, but with others, sometimes those personal dynamics have not been peachy and fuzzy. Believe me. I remember some very complex moments between Prime Minister Harper and President Barack Obama here in Washington. But
you tell.
I think that. There's one salient issue which is probably on the mind of Prime Minister Trudeau and President López Obrador, which is what's going to happen in the U.S. in 2024, what's going to happen on the road to 2024. Mexico and the United States will have presidential elections the same year. Mexico in the summer, the United States in the fall. With immigration policy in the United States becoming a third rail of domestic politics, that's what explains why President Biden stopped in El Paso for his first trip to the border since he assumed office 2 years ago, with immigration playing out the way it's playing out, with the Republican Party using the same manual that Trump used in his 2016 election in terms of using the border as a political electoral piñata. That's going to be a complex issue, and I think both Canada and the and Mexico may be sort of wondering what's going to happen in the presidential elections in 2024. Is Trump going to come back? Is a mini-me Trump going to come back and sort of resort to that same nationalistic, chauvinistic playbook? So I think in part two, there's, and this is probably happening not only in Ottawa and Mexico City, it's happening most likely in other diplomatic capitals around the world, a calculus of how much diplomatic bandwidth leaders engage with in their relationship with Biden and the United States, given the very profound, polarizing domestic politics that we're seeing in Washington here today. And so that's something that I think is playing a role. The issue of energy, I really sort of, if you were to poll most Mexicans, I think yes. If the question was, should Mexico defend its interests when it comes to energy? I think overwhelmingly people will say yes. But once you start breaking that down and you sort of drive it down to should Mexico pick a fight with Canada and the United States over the energy paradigm that President López Obrador is invested in, that's where you start getting a significant bunch of people saying that they don't agree with that. So domestic politics may play a bit of a different role, particularly on the energy issue, but it is a salient issue for López Obrador's party faithful and rank and file, undoubtedly.
Okay. In closing, we are still waiting for this news conference to start. We've got a live shot up there, and we've seen some of the various cabinet ministers. Certainly, I recognize some Canadian faces there, chit-chatting with some counterparts and officials. But as we wait to actually hear the leaders speak, I was hoping that both of you could kind of give us a closing thought about one thing to listen for, watch for, be it an issue or something about the shape of all of this that gives us a sense of whether or not this was indeed a meeting of substance. Scotty, I'll start with you.
Well, it absolutely was a meeting of substance. You're going to know that from the many issues that are outlined in all of the readouts about what they're doing there. I think there are 6 different issue areas, but for the leaders briefing itself, I think the issue is do they reference willingness to have North America act as a bloc? Or do they end up just speaking to their own domestic hometown crowd? So that's what I'll be looking at. Are they willing to kind of support each other in this North American idea? One other thing, Catherine, just really fast. I didn't mean to say every time any leaders get together, it's warm and fuzzy. I agree with the ambassador. Sometimes it's not. I just meant these particular ones are aligned on so many sort of values issues and they're happy to be meeting with each other. And it's in contrast with the previous president, who was kind of hard to meet with. So that's what I meant.
Yeah, I think we can appreciate the contrast. Arturo, we are going to have you back sometime to tell us those Harper-Obama stories, if that's something you feel like you can do. But today we'll ask you for just a bit of a closing thought of what to look for.
I would agree with Scotty that in my book, the most important thing that I would like to see coming out of this, and what I continually ask for when I talk about North America, is the vision thing. Do the three leaders understand the importance of North America working, engaging, collaborating as a bloc, whether it's on energy, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on migration flows, where the three countries signed the LA Declaration on Migration during the Summit of the Americas, whether it's on global and regional affairs. I thought it was incredibly important that on the eve of the summit, the three leaders put out a statement defending Brazilian democracy and condemning the unfortunate events that were playing out in Brasilia a couple of days ago. I think that was very relevant because that starts conveying a narrative to the rest of the world of what North America is about. So that's something that I'm looking for.
Okay, excellent. Arturo Sarukhán, former Mexican ambassador to the U.S., and Maryscott, Greenwood, CEO of the Canadian American Business Council. Thank you both so much for your expertise today.
Pleasure.
Always good to see you, Catherine.